como tú sabes, Redo es la organización que hace posible que todo esto suceda. Y pues bueno, ya este es el sexto mito. Estamos, wow. Entonces, bueno, para los que no nos conocen o es su primer mito, pues nosotros somos Manifesto. ¿Y qué somos? Básicamente una iniciativa para poder hacer, para crear comunidad con los temas o el eje central en User Experience, en Service Design y en Product Design. Y pues hacemos este tipo de dinámicas y los eventos para poder crear comunidad, compartir conocimiento, y traemos a ponentes que vienen para explicarnos, contarnos un poquito de su experiencia, qué es lo que se han encontrado en el mundo laboral allá afuera, hallazgos, insights, todo este tipo de cosas, de forma que nosotros podamos pues aprender, tener esa conversación y pues crecer todos juntos, ¿no? Manifesto somos nosotros tres, Laura por acá, yo, David, servidor, y Paulina Pimentel, que ahorita está en Argentina pues llevando un manifiesto pues, a nivel Latinoamérica. Y bueno, como les comentaba hace un momento, Bedu es nuestro patrocinador oficial. Tenemos buenas noticias. Sí, bueno, a todos los asistentes y a toda la comunidad de Manifesto, Bedu nos está regalando un 10% de descuento en todas las becas, tanto de dirección de negocios como de tecnología e de inglés. Entonces, si les interesa, acérquense con cualquiera de nosotros para que les digamos como cuál es el proceso, anoten este codiguito y pues ya con eso pueden tener el descuento, ¿vale? Se los quité muy rápido, perdón. ¿Estamos? Ahí estamos, ¿vale? Anoten su codiguito y si les interesa, pues acérquense con cualquiera de nosotros, ¿vale? Antes de empezar, algunas reglas. Les pedimos que porfa sus celulares al mínimo, si necesitan salir a contestar una llamada o un mensaje, pueden salir, está aquí como el espacio súper abierto. Esto por respeto al ponente y pues también a las personas que estamos tomando el mito o que estamos participando en la conferencia, ¿vale? No juzgamos, nos gusta mucho que ustedes participen, que nos den su punto de vista y tenemos que estar abiertos y ser receptivos a los diferentes puntos de vista, ¿vale? Entonces nada de no juzgar a las personas, no juzgar sus opiniones, estamos aquí para hacer comunidad, para pasarnos las padre y divertirnos, ¿ok? Lo mismo, respetar técnicas y opiniones, respetamos los tiempos. Muchas veces nos pasa pues que estamos como super metidos en el workshop o estamos super metidos en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas y se nos va como un poquito de la mano eso. Entonces, si a Caroline, Laura o yo le decimos como es momento de parar, es momento de concluir la actividad o de terminar lo que estamos haciendo, porfa, pues hagámoslo, sale esto para medir bien nuestros tiempos y pues que todo se cumpla en forma. Instrucciones, lo mismo, porfa, háganos caso, es para que por favor, para que todo esto fluya de manera correcta. Y por último, compartimos nuestras dudas y conocimiento, ¿vale? No hay preguntas tontas, yo sé que es como súper cliché la frase, pero si tienen alguna duda, levanten la mano y nosotros nos tocamos con ustedes, yo saco el micrófono para que Caroline pueda hacer cualquiera de sus preguntas. Y pues bueno, nos divertimos, ¿no? Aquí estamos para divertirnos, para aprender y para pasarnos las padres, ¿vale? Bueno,
solo recordarles, chicos, que el evento de hoy es en inglés. Nuestra ponente viene desde Nueva York, entonces pues eso, ya, pasa.
Ok, entonces pues los dejo con Caroline, denle un aplauso, vienen desde lejos.
Hey everyone, thank you for having me. I'm sorry I have to present in English. My Spanish is not good enough to talk about design in, so I'm sorry. We'll see what's up. Thank you for having me. I'm a design researcher and artist based in Berlin, Germany. I'm in town right now. I did a few talks and I'm actually on vacation, but I'm glad to be here with all of you. Yeah, that's probably, does that sound better? Cool. So I'm Caroline. I'm a design researcher who works at the intersections of civil society and the private sector, looking at the impacts of technology in society and how it affects marginalized groups, and how product design is sort of culpable in harms inside of technology. I've held residencies with BuzzFeed, the Mozilla Foundation, and currently I'm with Harvard University as a fellow with the Kennedy School. I used to work as a design researcher on natural language processing APIs, so that's just a fancy way to say machine learning that looks at conversations for IBM Watson.
Sorry, that's making weird noises, isn't it? Is this better? Can you all hear me? No? Okay.
Sorry, it's making these weird squeaky noises. So that's just a really sort of fancy way to say that I worked as an intermediary between the research team at IBM Watson and the product design team, and how we could think about artificial intelligence could be thought of as a product. So if you work with complex technology, sometimes even just the creation of that technology can be marketed as a product. So how it gets wrapped in like a web-ready API, or how you build an online demo about it, or how you even explain to people what it does. That was effectively my role, was working with the research team and taking something they had created inside of IBM Watson's research lab and thinking about how it could be really used as a product in society. So what I liked about that is just thinking about how artificial intelligence can affect product design, and how do we just think of new and emerging forms of technology from a product design lens. And now this is really what I'm focusing on as a researcher, which is how can we curb or limit technology's harms in society. And again, when I mean technology, I mean things like complex technology, like artificial intelligence and blockchain, the kind of technology your parents maybe ask you to explain to them over and over and over again. And then also how we can think about Facebook, which we could think of as a complex technology because it's so big and it does so many different things. Even if the product feels fairly straightforward to all of us, we understand that we can post content. It causes so many like volatile political situations that we really need to actually view something like Facebook or something like Twitter as an extremely complex technology. So this is what I think about, and this is what I am trying to answer as I work across research, civil society. So civil society is means like if you work analyzing the government, or like the harms of a government or the harms of a big tech. So you're not in academia, you're like a watchdog group, or you're like a nonprofit. And what you're looking at as like an outsider is you're like an impartial outsider, holding governments and technology to a high standard. And that's really sort of where I work, looking a lot at human rights inside of technology. Anyway, yeah, so this is, and then the slice where I like to work within that is how do you make technology understandable to the general public and everyday consumers. And I think it's with design. I think it's with really good UX design and legible design. And I think that because design is this action that can take code and policy and turn it into understandable interfaces. And I mean, I'm a designer, so I'm clearly biased that design can solve problems. But it's important to think of design not just as a skill, but as a practice in its own language. So if we're starting to solve problems around things like online harassment and create spaces for human connection, design needs to be at the forefront of the conversation. So design can be this thing that explains what code and policy are outlining. An example of this in practice is, how many of you have ever filed an online harassment report? Or have you ever like seen content on Facebook and reported it, or on Twitter, right? Okay, so if you've ever selected a piece of content and been like, I'm reporting this, the radio dials you see is a designer taking the policy of Twitter and Facebook and making it more readable to a user. That interface you see also, when you select like which section it fits into, it gets put into like a specific bucket on the back end. So when you file something like a harassment report or you report content, design is literally taking the policy of how Facebook has thought about what content is and different kinds of content, and then the technology of where that report goes, and makes it into this understandable interface for users. We also see this with things like privacy settings. So the idea is that you don't have to understand what encryption is to use something like WhatsApp. You just know that it's secure. This is what I mean when design is this equalizing action that can sort of take code and policy
and make it understandable for users. And this explanation I just gave you is a lot of what my research looks at, is where design fits into this space. And this research is something I'm calling design policy. And so design policy in action is like harassment reporting. Oops, sorry. So like, why would we need something like design policy, even outside of online harassment? Well, Wikipedia defines policy as a deliberate systems of principles to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. So a policy is a statement of intent, and it's implemented as a procedure or protocol. Policies are generally adopted by a governance body within an organization. So the TLDR definition of that is, a policy is just a good set of rules that help make things happen. Before we even started presenting today, we were given a set of rules of what we're allowed to do in this space. That's the policy of this space, right? And so rules provide structure. And as designers and technologists, we work a lot with rules and structure all the time. Code is rules, design is rules, code is structure, design is structure, right? So design policy is just recognizing that software and hardware are systems that have regulations to them, depending upon the country you're in. And then generally, platforms or big tech like Google also write policies around how we can use or how we shouldn't use their software and their products. So design policy looks at how we make policy easier to understand. And it's important because as users' data and privacy is being really mishandled, if we look at Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, it's important to think about how design fits into this space. As I said earlier, I'm based in Germany, so when I think of design policy, I think of this really small thing called GDPR. In Europe, this gets a lot of laughs because it's not a small thing, it's a really, really annoying big thing. So what is GDPR? GDPR is a law that was passed in European Parliament that sort of controls all media websites. So when you log onto a website, like maybe it'll be a newspaper, a pop-up appears and you have to consent to being tracked effectively. You're consenting for advertisers to advertise to you. And the GDPR aims to give control to individuals over their personal data, and it was the EU trying to create a unified regulatory environment across all the different countries in the EU. And so why would I talk about GDPR in Mexico City? I think it's a really great example of design policy. So the interesting thing about GDPR is it's actually a really wicked design problem as much as it is a policy problem. Because GDPR has to take privacy settings and cookies and create user consent flows in a way that's understandable for users, but it also has to be fast, because if people are going to a website to read content and they have to click through and read stuff, we all know as designers that's really, really frustrating. And that's a way to really, really anger users. So GDPR actually isn't a straightforward thing at all, and for designers, it's something that I argue is such a wicked design problem. And it becomes a wicked design problem because the law was written in a way that they clearly didn't talk to designers at all. Because GDPR gets radically misinterpreted. It's also not enforced very well. So let me show you some examples across websites of this misinterpretation. So this doesn't even have a GDPR notification. This is a right-wing website in the United States. But even still, like all websites, if they're accessed in Europe, have to have a GDPR notification, or they have to have some pop-up that says you're accessing the website in Europe. So this has nothing, which means they're breaking the law, and I should report them immediately. And I will. So if there are any websites you don't like in Mexico, you can send them to me and I can look at them in Europe and I can report them and they could get fined. I'm actually serious, you could really email me and I'll totally do it. This is another example. So do we think that this is implementing GDPR correctly? Do you see any way to say no? No. Right. So we could argue that this is also technically illegal because it's either accept and read Harper's Bazaar or don't read it, which is not a choice. So what about this one? So this one is really bad design. How many of you have heard of dark patterns before? Dark patterns are manipulative design patterns that are intentionally or unintentionally implemented. One could argue that when designers create dark patterns, some of them don't know they're doing it. I would argue this is an intentional dark pattern. Why? Okay, you can accept or you can click on show purposes. When you click on show purposes, that's where you get the reject all. So this is a very clear dark pattern. A designer was clearly given a goal or like a mandatory requirement in making this. And so we could argue that this doesn't really hold up the spirit of GDPR as designers because is show purposes legible and understandable to users? Do you think that's the place you could go to as a user to hit reject? No. So if this bill had been written, if they had talked to a designer, we could have said things like they need to be equal in hierarchy, the buttons need to be legible, you need to clearly let people have a reject next to an accept, right? Basic things that if we were to design a GDPR notification, we could make in like 2 minutes, right? So GDPR does get implemented correctly here, right? Legible, easy to see. Thank you, The Atlantic. So the reason I show this is I think it's a really great provocation for policymakers, but also designers, that as different bodies are passing regulation, it's going to fall, I think, on design, on UX design and UI design of how these things get implemented and regulated. And I think it's important also to understand outside of the EU that there's been a lot of talk at Twitter and Facebook and Google that whatever regulations get passed in the EU will be affected globally because Twitter, Facebook, and Google can't cut an EU-sized hole out of their market. So it's easier for them to just adhere to regulation that happens in Europe and implement it across the entire world. The slight upside to that is Europe is very pro-data privacy. The downside to that is, I don't know. There's probably lots of downsides. They're not talking to the rest of the world. But I bring this up because it's important to think about, when we start to think about ethics and design, just these basic things. So if tech needs structure, users need agency. And this big issue I see right now between civil society and corporate tech and design is what does specificity in terms of the structure look like? As opposed to just saying like ethics are good. Like what is a practical ethics guide? So there are a lot of ethics guides or outlines that don't really explain how to manifest their suggestions into actionable takeaways for designers. It's one thing to say make better tech, but what does better mean? What does better mean here in this room versus in San Francisco, right? What does better mean in Berlin versus here? Better isn't really a word. It doesn't really mean anything because there's not a specificity to it. What's better and better for who, right? So I think in trying to solve these problems, we need a new form of design methodologies that aren't just talking about ethics, but they actually try to break it down into an understandable way. So a group of designers and I who work in the human rights space are creating what's called human rights-centered design. So we're taking human-centered design and trying to update it now for tool makers, for everyday designers if you work in corporate tech, but also for people that think about social justice or ethics. And we're focusing on human rights because if we look at big technology companies, they're creating human rights atrocities. It's been shown and proven recently that Facebook has had a hand in the genocide in Myanmar, just based off of how little they were analyzing the misinformation that was coming out of Myanmar. So this is real, right? Design and technology can kill people. It can have widespread effects. So right now we're at the perfect time and space to update human-centered design. It was created in the 90s, the term was invented in the 1980s, 2020 is the perfect time. Let's reimagine it for right now. And human rights-centered design is inspired by the UN's International Declarations on Human Rights, which outlines basic inalienable rights afforded to all people. So in design, we're trying to think about what that could mean. If human rights is also thinking about sovereignty and the ability to freely express oneself, then what does that look like online? We could argue it's user agency, relationships to data ownership, and transparency, and that's presented in a variety of different languages. So instead of having things focus on English and on a US idea of data privacy, we need to have a more global one, and one that's focused on the global South. So a lot of this is thinking, or sort of going forward, is we have to give consumers ways to opt out better. So instead of just automatically turning services on, how do we better explain what those services do? Or how can we let them very easily change and adjust things? How can we let them see how an algorithm affects them in a product? How can we let them say yes and no? Can we give users ways to remove their data from AI data models, for example? Instead of just thinking about ease and usability and accessibility, which are important things, we have to start going a step further, thinking about what agency looks like in UX design. For the sake of time, I won't cover this, but this is part of a design methodology online that some friends and I have written that I can send to Laura and have sent out to all of you. It's just ways that we think about trying to protect users' data as we go through the research and building an ideation process for product design. Feel free to take pictures. It's an open source curricula. Currently it's on GitHub. I know, I'm sorry. That's not very design friendly. Here's another example. So it's just as you're running through the process, these are just tips and tricks for you to think about. And this is being built into like a more full-blown design curricula, sort of inspired by IDEO's design kit. And it will be released in about a year under a completely open source license, so all of you can use it. And we are hoping to localize it in a variety of languages, including Spanish. So it won't just be translated. We're going to actually try to work with designers to make sure that all the translations actually make sense and don't just sort of read like it's been Google translated, because that's not useful to anybody. So yeah, this is the next stage, so prototyping and building. And again, feel free to take pictures. This is online. I will have it circulated out later today or tomorrow. And also some more. So as we're moving forward, I think it's important to highlight what could be called, like, what are human rights violations in design? Which human rights policy researchers hate it when I say that, because they're like, you're making human rights violations like not as serious. I'm like, no, they're very serious. People die using Facebook. So what are human rights design violations? I think this one's pretty obvious, but facial recognition systems. So according to a study conducted by MIT's Joy Bellamy, as cited in the New York Times, her study found that Amazon's recognition has much more difficulty in recognizing gender in dark-skinned faces and in female faces. Recognition, which is the name of Amazon's facial recognition system, performed worse than software by Microsoft and IBM, though both Microsoft and IBM software wasn't accurate as well. So generally, all of the big leading companies that are developing facial recognition systems are making ones that just don't recognize darker skinned female faces. So they're having a hard time in general just recognizing people that are not white males, which color me shocked. But who really uses this? It gets used all the time at border crossings, especially in the EU. It gets used in the United States in software hiring. So if you're going to interview for a job, maybe they're running facial recognition and emotion recognition during your interview. If it's not working very well, that is super questionable. But it's also used in different countries by law enforcement, which is very, very serious and very, very problematic. So when we think about human rights violations, we also have to think about something that, even if it's developed in a lab or it's developed with the best intentions, what are all the downstream effects? Facial recognition, I think it's very obvious that it could be used in surveillance situations, and it is. But we also have emotion recognition systems, because emotion recognition systems use facial recognition systems to analyze what you're feeling, which is really bad. Why is that bad? Well, let's ask, what does anger look like in an emotion recognition system? Also, is anger universally expressed? Do we express anger here in Mexico the same way that a German would express anger? No, definitely not. Germans have little emotions. So apparently what anger looks like according to this system is lowered brows and tight pressed lips and big bulging eyes. And that's how it's trained and described to this system. That's what anger looks like. And this labeling comes from a system called the Emotion Facial Coding System, or MFACS for short, developed by Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen in the 1980s. And this system that defines emotions, the one where it's like anger looks like bulging eyes, that's used by most emotion recognition systems today. And MFACS can actually be traced back to the 1960s, where Ekman and two other colleagues hypothesized that there are 6 universal emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. And that these emotions are expressed and can be detected across all cultures. So, what makes that wrong? I'm going to give you an American example. This is, I think, maybe this is a universal emotion. How many of you have heard of resting bitch face? So one of my really, really close friends has resting bitch face and resting bitch voice. And I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, which is not that far from Mexico City, but it's very far from Berlin, where I'm based. So I will text this friend and be like, hey, coming back in town, and she'll respond with like all these emojis. She's like, oh, I'm, so excited to see you, lots of hearts, like exploding stars. When I see her, she's always like, it's really been a long time. But she's excited. She just doesn't classically express excitement the way that this system would assume that's what excitement looks like. But she's expressing excitement for herself. Or let's give an even more real world situation. How many of you have ever laughed or smiled when you've been scared or upset? Probably most of you, probably all of you at some point. The thing to keep in mind about emotion recognition systems is even if they were 100% accurate, it assumes a false pretense about society. It assumes that we are constantly expressing our real emotions all the time. We can't do that. We can't do that for a variety of reasons. We can't do that because society is an unequal place. So if you are a person of color with darker skin, you can't show your anger a lot of times. Or if you're a woman and someone's making you uncomfortable, you also can't express anger, usually. Because we're talking about safety inside of a power structure. But also, even if we had equality, it's still improper to express all of our emotions. For example, if some of you are really bored, if you flipped the table over leaving right now, that would be rude, right? That'd be really rude. You can't express that emotion right now. You probably wouldn't get invited back here. Or if I was annoyed, I wouldn't throw the projector on the ground, right? That would be awful. So the point of emotion recognition systems, it just assumes from the get-go false pretenses about society. We are not constantly expressing what we're thinking and feeling. And that's it's one of the reasons I show this, because emotion recognition systems are also being used in hiring software, and most likely they're going to get used in things like court cases and with law enforcement agencies. Some could argue that this is just technology that I'm talking about, but it's not, because the border crossing is a product. It's hardware and software that an airport bought. Or hiring software, a product designer worked on that, right? And a technologist made that technology more usable for a product. So it's just important to think about how artificial intelligence actually can be used and misused when we start to think of it from a product design lens. So how can we fix it? I think a lot of that is we can use or start thinking about human rights inside of human-centered design by asking, well, what is the harm of this? And trying to walk through and think of all the extents of the harm across many different groups. You're not just designing for yourself and your friends, you're designing for marginalized people. You're designing for people who maybe live with a lot more danger in their day-to-day. So we can look at other examples out in the wild too. So this is a project created by Google's special group called Jigsaw. And the idea is that it's trying to analyze online toxicity. And I don't like this project. It's called Perspective. And I don't like it only because I can see the potential of it and how they consistently fall short in really showing what the product is. Perspective is an API to rate toxicity in comments, specifically in newspaper commenting sections. So what's the product? It's this model and an API that's been presented on a demo page. And the model is supposed to be implemented in a variety of different design interfaces. So what I want to argue is when we start to see new forms of artificial intelligence shown to us on these demo pages, we should interrogate these as deeply as we would the actual product, because this is what's only publicly available. It's very hard to see actually what Jigsaw is using Perspective for, because they very rarely let non-clients see the tool. So all we have to go on is just this demo page. This product has been online since 2017, and only a few months ago it got a redesign. And I know this because I've been following the project since it launched. Now, this may not seem very long ago, but developers and journalists have constantly been asking for feedback and more transparency on what Perspective does and how it performs, and how it was trained, and also what the model looks like. So one could argue Perspective says that they give enough information. So what I'm asking is, do we think that this is fairly transparent? As designers, I sort of ask that we put our design hats on and think about, if this were a product, what does this page really say to users? What is the page doing? So this page is showing you that the tool can recognize a theme, but it's not really showing you toxicity. One thing I want to highlight is, for me as a design researcher, I've worked a lot with journalists. A lot of the work that I do is also looking at harassment that journalists have faced, but I've held residencies at BuzzFeed, a journalism group. I've held residencies inside the New York Times as well as with the Washington Post. So as a designer, I spend a lot of time looking at the design of newspaper websites. I spend a lot of time talking to journalists. So one could argue that I'm an expert in perhaps natural language processing and commenting sections. So what's the problem with this? Generally, in newspaper CMS systems, that's like the structure for how journalists can upload articles and whatnot, most CMS systems have a place for a journalist to tag what the theme of the article is. So journalists are already tagging if their article is about climate change. You don't need machine learning to get that information, because all journalist sites already have that. So the reason I bring this up is it seems clear to me that Perspective was designed without actually consulting journalists or looking at the pre-existing tools of newspaper sites. Even if the model is so great that it can recognize different themes, that's not actually a technology that journalists needed, because their structured CMS system already has places for them to add tags about what the article actually is about. And that takes just a few seconds for a journalist to say, climate change, President Trump, right? You don't need AI to actually do that. So I'm going to show you another example, and I'm going to give a slight trigger warning. There is some text that is used by neo-Nazi and white supremacy groups. If you feel uncomfortable at any time, please feel free to leave. So this is Perspective in action. What is this statement? This is the most popular white supremacy phrase in the world, often known as the 14 words. It's used by a lot of neo-Nazi groups in English-speaking countries as well as across Europe. So it's, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. Below the rating says it's unsure if this follows community guidelines. But how can I see where it falls on the spectrum of toxic comments? This is clearly hate speech. And it's hate speech that many different researchers of hate speech classify as hate speech. So it goes beyond toxicity. So as a user, I wonder, how is this trained and how is it analyzing actually what toxic language is? I can see that it can recognize themes, but if the point of this artificial intelligence system is to look at abusive language, then how is it analyzing this and how can I see what it's doing? And this is where design is really important. How could we here redesign this to be more legible? Should we have a graph, a series of graphs, pop-ups, better language, something? What would we need on this page to actually make it more legible to see how the model itself is working? Because right now all we get is this really teeny tiny text above customized feedback, which that's where you can submit feedback. They aren't showing you anything. So let's go further. What does toxic mean? That's a pretty good definition, I guess. But I'd love to know more. Who made it? How did they define it? Where did they get toxicity from? Now, if you go back through this demo and you scroll down and down and down, they offer a GitHub page and developer links, etc. But I went through every link they've listed, and a lot of those lead to 404 pages or packed GitHub pages that don't really make any sense to everyday non-technical users. So I saw this in thinking about if we're creating better ethical tech, if you're relying on documentation as just a form of transparency, you're only designing for a very small slice of the population. This website, someone designed it for perspective. Google put time into it. They paid people to work on it. So why doesn't it better explain what it's doing and really show what is happening? This is from Google, right? So I'm using this to start a conversation. How can we design better? One could argue ethically, I would say more transparently with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Users should know what it's doing and why. So as a part of my most recent fellowship with the Mozilla Foundation, I started thinking about my own guidelines for designing for transparency inside of machine learning. And I started to think about transparency for all users, not just the most technical. So my project outlines 3 just general principles for designing for transparency in machine learning, which is legibility, the ability to audit, and creating spaces for impact or interaction, and using design to explain what is happening inside of an algorithm, a data model, or a product. And this builds off of a paper that was written by a variety of researchers called Data Sheets for Data Models. Pardon me. So legibility is the ability to understand. This is inspired by a civic technology group called 18F's Plain Language Guide to Designing for the Federal Government. So think about it. Bureaucratic procedures, even banking procedures, for example, need to be explained in plain language for everyday people. Sometimes the technical or specific language isn't the best language to actually describe things for people. And this is true in machine learning. So for example, percentages of accuracy are called confidence levels. How does the everyday person relate to the word confidence? They don't think of it as a percentage of accuracy. So if you're going to show results from a machine learning data model, you can't call them confidence scores. You need to call them something else, right? This is something we were researching back in 2016 when I worked at IBM Watson. We quickly realized our language didn't make sense to people, and we changed it. So this is why legibility is so important. We need legibility to explain what is happening inside a product and algorithm and what it's doing. So legibility can be showing or explaining what's happening inside of a data set. Then there's auditability, which is not a real word, but it should be, which is the ability to understand a process, data point, or intention. So someone can understand what's happening so well, building upon legibility, that they can have an opinion about it and offer feedback, so that users actually understand what the AI model is doing so well that they can say, I think that that's bullshit, and here's why, based off how you've described it. But if you can understand something and have an opinion about it, is that really transparent? For example, an oil company can say that they're going to drill somewhere. Is that a form of transparency if you can't affect change? So the provocation I give to companies is, if you're going to say your processes are transparent, what you mean by transparency should be beyond just revealing things. People need interaction or agency. They need the ability to give impact. So people can understand your process so well that they can have an opinion, they can put the opinion somewhere, and you have to respond to the opinion. And that would be more true transparency, which Perspectives demo does not have. But moving forward, I want to think more deeply about ideas of legibility and transparency. So do data sets need ratings? Should they be thought of like ingredients, or like, I don't know, food has calorie, labels and ingredient labels? Should data be peer reviewed? Should this be listed with data sets, for example? Like this basic kind of readable information? What if Facebook had some of this stuff actually implemented in some of their different products? Or if there was a data portal we could all look at? What if Netflix had this? What if they had ratings of how well their algorithms reflected a general population in specific countries? I bet that would change a lot of the way that Facebook is designed if, for example, you could do that in Mexico. Oops, sorry. So what is transparency in action? So for Harvard's Shorenstein Center, which is a journalism center, they put together a publication called Privacy by Design. They asked me to make something. And I thought about this really awful interaction I had with Spotify. So I dated a boy who looked like a Disney prince, and he broke my heart. And I did what a lot of people do, and I listened to Spotify a lot. And I listened to this band that like no one should be proud to listen to. How many of you have heard of the band Mumford & Sons? Oh yeah. So I listened to that every single day for a month. And when I say I listen to it every single day, I mean I only listened to Mumford & Sons. So you know what that did? It fucked up my Discover Weekly. And that was 4 years ago. And I still get like all folk pop recommendations to this day. So when Shorenstein Center was like, do you want to do something about algorithms? I was like, let's do something about Spotify. Because I want to know how to change my Mumford & Sons AI model that I created in a moment of heartbreak. And I think this is important actually for designers to talk about, because no one's going to die from using Spotify. I may feel like I want to die when I open up Spotify, but I'm not going to be physically hurt from listening to Mumford & Sons, unless you can die from cringing too much. But the provocation I make to all of you is, I use Spotify every day, and Spotify thinks of Discover Weekly as a separate product, and they market it as a product. So why can't I intervene in this thing that I love as a user? I love Discover Weekly. I am like one of those people that waits to see like what Spotify is gonna give me every week. And it's an entertainment product, right? So why can't I just tell them like, actually, this is really what I'm interested in. This is what I wanna know, right? If an algorithm is looking for user flags and cues, some of those cues may not be good. Some of those flags may be an accident or a breakup. So why can't I say, like, give me more Selena and Sia, and why not Korean pop music? Can we just not have Mumford & Sons? So this provocation was thinking about how maybe like an ingredients label could sit on top of Discover Weekly. So it'd say Discover Weekly and then like this I thing. You click on it and be like, cool, this is how we kind of made the algorithm. It doesn't have to be super, super specific, but it has to be legible. So maybe I could kind of understand like, oh, right, they made this in a certain time period when Mumford & Sons was really popular. And they also analyze maybe like playlist links and song links, or how often you replayed one thing, right? What is information users could have or would need to understand why something works? Then on the other side is my data. So maybe I can suppress data or uplift things. Maybe I can say like, this week actually what I want is this album to influence whatever you're going to surprise me with, right? Like, why can't you have this kind of more granular control? And I think it's important because what I just described effectively was like a UX add-on on top of Discover Weekly. Because design is important. It can like shift and create these spaces of interventions and translations of what technology does. And design can make mediocre technology feel like great technology, or vice versa. It can make really, really great technology feel really, really bad. So as we think about human rights-centered design, I want us to think about not just Facebook, but also the Spotify example. Human rights-centered design is thinking about advocacy, usability, and agency in this conversation with design. It's thinking about plain languages in apps and pages and demos. And it's thinking about following usability standards, but also making sure everything is really, really legible. And this was my talk. Thank you. Do we have any questions? I guess just start with, yeah, you.
My question is,
first of all, thank you. It was a great presentation. I guess if we, deep inside, we know that modern digital products are not ethical enough. Yeah. And second, how do you think AI and machine learning can help improve accessibility? Yeah, because you mentioned that the human right to access information is a human right, right? So that's it. How do you think we can improve accessibility through AI and machine learning?
That's a really great question, thank you. I don't think that there's going to be one answer to your question, though. So when I think of accessibility, the first thing I think about is disability accessibility. So there's this amazing designer named Liz Jackson, and she created a product called Thyssen to help create translations. But the idea is, like, if we had Thyssen running right now, we could all help translate with Thyssen. So machine learning that's listening to translate speech to text is not accurate, even with people that speak like American English very, very, very clearly. It's not great. And Liz Jackson is a disabled designer. And in the disability community, they call bad captions craptions, because they're not very good. And so if people can't hear and they're trying to read, they're sometimes not getting all the accurate information. So Liz had this idea after attending a disability talk at South by Southwest, and there were no translators. There was no one to do machine translation, and they had a deaf woman on stage, and South by didn't even provide her with a translator. Luckily, she brought her own. But Liz had this idea of, well, what if this is a thing that could exist at conferences, but then we could all kind of help out? Because generally, some people take notes. I've seen a lot of you taking notes. I used to live tweet conferences. It could be a thing we're all kind of working on together. And so we're kind of crowdsourcing together talk transcriptions. So I think this is a great way where it's not machine learning fixing something, but it's someone recognizing machine learning can be helpful in creating more available information in just a kind of a faster and more cheaper and accessible way. And I mean accessible in like a financially accessible and time accessible way. But I guess then thinking more forward, I don't know how we can use machine learning as an investigative tool to force Facebook, for example, to give us better information, or to force a government or a banking institution to give us more information. I think that's where like auditing bodies and trusted third parties like NGOs or nonprofits are really, really useful. But I do think, machine learning surrounds us. It's in so many products you use in an everyday space. And it's used in spaces you don't even think about, like how subways work. A lot of subway assistants are using automation that comes from like very early forms of machine learning, right? So it's surrounding all of us. So what I sort of think is, well, maybe what we need are better explanations around that. Like, I don't know how my bank uses machine learning at all, but I know that they're using it. But I don't know in what context, and I don't know if it benefits me or not. And so there's no way for me to go in and say, like, how are you doing this? Why are you doing it? how are you protecting my data, right? And so, like, I think that kind of relationship needs to be sort of pulled out more. Like, I would love to know more about how Siri gets updated, or Cortana, for example. That uses machine learning. And I think that's maybe the first step. I don't know how we use machine learning at itself to make things more accessible, but I don't know. Yeah, it could just be a tool. Sure, thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name's Franco. So I had two questions. One of my favorite movies is Watchmen, and there's a phrase in that movie that says, "Who watches the Watchman?"
Yeah.
And I think, like, I always think about the tech barons like that, like who's watching Amazon, who's watching Facebook. So I like the example you said about GDPR in the sense that it's budget. So my first question is, what can help a policy team or a policymaker be more attuned to what is human rights centered design if they have the drive to regulate, but when they regulate, it's completely budget in that sense. And then the second one is, what would be a low-hanging fruit that tech companies can implement to actually have this human rights centered design for impact?
Totally. Those are two really great questions.
I think the first one that comes to mind is like designers looking for jobs in places that are not like big tech companies. So city governments, for example, need graphic designers and UX designers. Like civic technologists need graphic designers. A really good friend of mine who's in Mexico, her name is Paula Villarreal. She used to work with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. She now helps run an open data initiative with the Mexican government. And so a lot of that is also trying to think about transparency in relationship to governmental policies. So she's a technologist who works on this thing, right? And she has ties to civil society, and she thinks a lot about human rights. And she's here in Mexico City. There are meetups that think about civic tech. I don't know a lot of them here, but I'm sure they exist because Paola's here, and that is a thing she's interested in. But like most cities will have things like that, or countries, for example. But there are also there are nonprofits and NGOs that are based in Central America and South America who are designed to primarily watch tech companies and to do research about them. So in Mexico, there's Luchadores, for example, that comes to mind. In Brazil, there's Coding Rights. Coding Rights looks a lot at like online harassment. I've been doing research on online harassment against journalists, some in Mexico, some in South America. So there are these groups that cover that. Berkman Klein in the United States, they're with Harvard, they try to pick a lot of fellows from across the world who focus on like data privacy and data activism. So there are these groups that are already out there. If you're looking for even more of them, there's a group called Access Now that holds a conference called RightsCon. So if you are like me, I often look for talks, and then I look for the people on the panels, and I look for their talks and their articles and who they are, and then I follow them on Twitter and sometimes on Instagram. I know that's really annoying, but there are ways to like find people's information, and there are human rights conferences that deal with technology. I think the position I was in is I happen to be working in big tech. IBM's really big, like super big. But I like somehow managed to meet a few people who were interested in like human rights work through different design meetups. Because I was looking for people that were talking about AI, and a lot of people that were having interesting conversations about AI were my coworkers. They were social science researchers and professors. And that opened this door into me finding human rights technology. But in human rights, people need designers. Like, all different kinds of groups need designers frequently. So I think a lot of it's also on us to go and find those spaces and see how we can be helpful, or see what we can learn and bring them back to our sort of everyday places. So for me, a lot of it at IBM was thinking about, well, if we're going to release software, how can I help test it in a way to see what our blind spots are? And how can I change what my blind spots are as a white American woman when I'm thinking about technology? So I think those are great places to start, for example. Like when you're, if you go and talk to like human rights researchers or human rights people, just then thinking about, well, if I make this app that helps people share Pokemon cards, how could that be used in a bad way? I don't know. Can people harass each other by sharing Pokemon cards? Yes, they can. 100%. So it's hard to think about, like, as you're designing stuff, are you thinking about how can people harass each other? What does the harassment look like? Does it differ when they're in a different country? How easily can they find support tools, like how to file a claim, for example? All of these things are ways to shift your thinking as you're designing. Any other questions?
Hello, thanks for the keynote, it was amazing. I also like both examples about the GDPR, where it's more law enforcement policies, and this one perspective that falls short. My question is, what's your position about how to push better this ethical agenda through designers? Is it about education, or is it more like making more strict regulations like automotive industry that is heavily regulated and it doesn't have any point to tweak or bend the rules? What's your position? It's education or regulations to be more effective?
Thank you, that was a really great question. I think it's both. I mean, I live in Europe, so regulation is a thing that happens all the time. But I grew up in the US where things never get regulated. So for me, I think it's both at the same time. What I like to think about is we have all these different levers as people in society. So a lever can be policy regulation. Maybe if it's in the EU, that still is helpful here, right? It's still helpful in the US. Another lever is the press reporting on like an app doing something really messed up, right? So bad press is a lever in terms of like shifting design. But I think it's also designers trying to think more about different kinds of users and again like the impact of harm. So I think for a while when we were designing, we would think about just some of the users we had spoken to, and we would think about only positive use cases, right? So like if we're sort of given a problem of how can people plan better travel, we frame it in a very positive way, right? We'll think, oh, well, maybe Juan is really, he gets annoyed because it's so hard to use this thing, but we've made this thing and it's gonna do X, Y, Z, and like that's a positive framing of it. So when we go about prototyping and building and ideating, I think we're coming at it from a solution standpoint, from a handful of specific problems, but we aren't auditing our solutions. We aren't thinking like, okay, so like, when does this go wrong? And how bad can it go wrong? So let's think of all the ways it could possibly go wrong. So when I was in design school, this is one thing my teacher, Clay Shirky, really emphasized a lot. He would have us quickly come up with product ideas. So we had one around like a bike sharing app, and then he'd be like, what happens if the bike gets like set on fire and is culpable or related in a murder? He's like, what do you do? Now that could happen. That could totally happen, right? That can happen in car sharing apps, in any kind of like consumer app where they can share stuff, right? So his emphasis was like actually think about, even if these things seem really shocking or extreme, like if it happens once, that's not an edge case, like that's a thing that you allowed in the design of your app, and you're responsible for that. So for me, that's completely shifted the way I think about creating, because I'm constantly thinking of, okay, like what are all these different kinds of harms, from the most extreme, like what happens if my product is culpable in a murder, all the way down to what happens if my app just makes someone really annoyed and they give me like a 2-star rating in the App Store, right? So we're thinking about these different kinds of frictions. And so that is my, those are my user stories and like my user personas that I draw from frequently. And I think if we can make so many of those, really robust ones, that can be really helpful. I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist, but I think that if we can sort of change the way we're designing just away from positivity and just more rooted in reality, that's sort of the basis of human rights-centered design. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I was thinking every bit of this sounds really good. In my case, it's more like in theory because I try to implement most of this on my work. But I have found myself on many cases where I found dark patterns. I tried to better them to make them more usable, and I've been told by the choice makers that that's not appropriate for the enterprise, for the earnings, etc., etc. How do you deal with this? That's the question.
That's a really great question. My first response is, because I'm this kind of person, is I would anonymously email a tech journalist and point out all the dark patterns, because I've done that before. But I think so not knowing what the product is, if there are ways to say, like, we're abusing customer loyalty and a returning customer and a continued customer is a better customer than just a new one-time customer. And so dark patterns break their trust in our platform. And if our competitors don't have dark patterns, that's maybe where they're gonna go, right? Like, so that's what I would come back to. Designing for Real Life, which is this really great design book, has a chapter on this, and they talk about customer loyalty. And they also talk about ways to internally have these conversations at work. And I think customer loyalty is a great one, for example. Because again, a returning continued use customer makes a fair amount of money. A one-time use customer, how much, like, what are the cost benefit analysis? So I think that's what I would come back to. There are studies on dark patterns. I would maybe pull those up and be like, look, users actually do find these really frustrating, and dark patterns are frustrating. So we're giving people frustrating spaces that also are manipulative, and our competitors don't have that. When users realize that, they will leave. I don't know if bad press works, but I do know bad press works really well for tech companies. So like a big thing, the reason that they will shift is because they're trying to avoid bad press. So I don't know also if that affects your company. I'd be like, I think that's worth bringing up. Like, you know, this is something that a journalist will find.
So, thanks.
Hello, and thank you for the talk. It's a very interesting topic, and I want to, I don't know, like return to the point of cover all the user stories, because I think that as a designer, it's very difficult to cover all the stories because you know the diversity of our users. So I think this, I see this like design principles that apply for the ethics of the user, but how could be the metrics that help us to evaluate this principle design for ethics? Because also I think that it's not design the principles itself, but to have a framework to evaluate and integrate these principles, and that are going to like adapt or be human-centered design, because they are going to be iterated and not implemented or thinking by the designer. So in summary, what my question is, how could you generate a framework to evaluate the design principles for ethics in a product?
That's a really great question. Thank you. So I should just highlight, I actually don't do very well with hypotheticals, so I always like to think of a specific thing. So if your app deals with people sending money or Pokemons to each other, and you can talk to each other, most likely, right, people have engaged in harassment. So I think it's spending time on like fan sites in that case to find that, right? So in your day-to-day, maybe you're a banking app, and if you're thinking like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what is a harm in your banking app. Maybe it's really hard if you have low cell phone access. A great way to present, like, we should really think about connectability, but in terms of like mobile phones and maybe a variety of different kinds of smartphones, that means we get to reach this brand new audience. So I'm trying to think of the best way to answer your question. I think sometimes giving a setup to a problem is really helpful. So if, again, you have an app where people can even just poke at each other, there are institutions that study online harassment. So you could reach out to them and say, do you know harassment cases on this app? Do you know of harassment cases on and list your competitors' apps, right? And then you can come back and present this deck and be like, so when I was doing like the landscape analysis, a quick field scan of like what's out there, I actually found like these weird things, and they were written about and documented by this really respected think tank that looks at this kind of harassment, for example. So a lot of it's figuring out where you sit in the market, and then like what are the problems are that you're working on. So for example, if it is like, we really don't care about low connectivity users, that's still a really great way to emphasize like those people are out there and they have money and we need to reach them, right? And so you just look up a study or a series of studies that maybe a university has done on how people use phones with low connectivity and like what they're using, right? And how they're talking to each other. So I think a lot of it is, for us as designers, is maybe trying to find the research labs and the think tanks that are doing a lot of this research on the ground. They're doing user research. They just don't realize that they're doing user product research for us. And that's the space I really occupy, is taking civil society and being like, you found out that journalists are being harassed online and they're being harassed in these ways? Cool, I tried to wireframe up what solutions could look like, and my surveys I do and my interviews I do with journalists who face harassment are often user interviews, and they're thinking about products. So like the research I do is trying to take pre-existing harassment research and translate it into a product landscape. So it's possible, right? It's just trying to figure out like what is the slice of your problem and how do you reframe it in a way where you can find a research lab working on it. So again, this is where hypotheticals are really difficult for me. But was that helpful? Yeah. Okay. I mean, you can have a follow-up question if you want, or if there is like an app that you're thinking of or a problem you're thinking of, we can always walk through it together.
But the question, once you are once you are decide that you are going to test an hypothesis, how do you evaluate? Because it always is going to be like an iterative process.
Totally.
With an interface or an strategy, I think that it works in the same way.
So I mean, I guess again, the big thing is like, are you testing with the right groups? And so this is where I come back to like, even if one person can be killed using your app, that's still like a failure that you've designed, right? So if you're like looking at like, if you're thinking of testing a new feature, are you thinking about or walking through who needs that feature the most? And who's the most vulnerable group using the feature? So if you're thinking about rolling out an update on a banking app, but it doesn't work in low connectivity areas, then the people you should test with, right, should be people in low connectivity areas, especially if they're using that app, right? So that's kind of what I mean, like walking through and thinking about it, is you have to think about the most vulnerable, because when you can design well for them, everyone else benefits, right? And then if you have to justify that, the bottom line is we get more and more users. We get more and more returning customers. Any other question? Do any women have any questions?
Tenemos tiempo para un par de respuestas más, preguntas.
No pressure. Then you can ask more questions too.
Okay, that's. I guess that it's all. So, thank you, Caroline, for being here. We're gonna go. An applause, please.
Ok, tenemos un pequeño problema con la pizza, aún no llega, pero ahí atrás hay chelas, entonces ya conocen un poquito la dinámica, pueden pasar ahí atrás, tomarse una chela,
Esperar la pizza.
Bueno, chicos, tenemos unos minutitos, ya van a llegar, en unos 10 minutitos están ahí las pizzas, ya están las chelas y la agüita por allá. Muchas gracias por haber venido. Les quiero pedir dos favores antes de irse. La primera es, si no los checamos en la entrada, porfa, acérquense con nosotros para escanear su registro. Esto es con la finalidad de que les sigan llegando notificaciones, bueno, más bien invitaciones a nuestros siguientes eventos. El próximo va a ser a finales de marzo con Gustavo Colorado, quien es lead designer de Bedu y va a hablar sobre sistemas de diseño y un poquito de accesibilidad. También están invitados. Y lo segundo es que vamos a estar regalando 8 entradas para Talentland, pero solamente aquellas personas que puedan comprobar realmente que van a ir al evento, ¿va? Vamos como comunidad para allá, tal vez demos algunas charlas en Talentland. Y bueno, si ustedes gustan ir, nos escriben, tenemos 8, solamente que sí vamos a ser muy estrictos en que nos comprueben que van, porque si no van o los cachan vendiendo las entradas que les vamos a regalar, básicamente nos penalizan de por vida a la comunidad y no vamos a poder regalarles pues entradas nunca más, ¿va? Muchas gracias por haber venido, chicos, síganos en Manifesto Noob en todas nuestras redes, por ahí van a poder ver el streaming de la charla de Caroline y pues nada, pásenle a las chelas. Gracias.
Gracias.